Good evening, everybody, and I want to warmly welcome you to our webinar on patient engagement on medicines research and development. We will have, as you probably could see, 6 speakers this evening, and then we have some time for questions and answers. We will also try to still answer questions written after the webinar if we don't have time to get through all of them. I'll let Apostolos explain you a little bit how you can become interactive during the webinar.
Good evening, everybody. So you have in front of you on the left side of your screen the presentation slides as they will be going through. And it's quite important to pay attention on the right side of your screen where there is the control panel. As attendees, you are all muted. We cannot actually hear you. The procedure will be for you to, while the presenters are presenting, for you to write down questions in the box that you will see in the control panel under questions. And those questions will be answered during the questions and answers session in the end of the webinar. We like to we would like to keep your questions short and also try to address your questions to particular presenters so they can reply to your questions. If there is still time and you have some questions that they are not answered yet, you can also raise your hand towards the end of the webinar, and we can reply to more questions that you have. So I give the floor to Koen and the presenters.
Thank you, Apostolos. So as I will be your moderator this evening, so my name is Koen, I'm from EATG, and I'm very pleased to welcome our first speaker, who is Nicola Bedlington from EPF, who will talk about it. Who will give us an introduction to the patient engagement webinar series.
Thank you very much, Koen. Good evening, everybody. Let's make patient engagement great again. We've all heard this somewhere around before, but this is so important. We really need to focus, and it's fantastic that we have so many people joining our webinar today. The 4 patient organisations, the European Patients Forum, Eurodis, the Rare Diseases Europe, Alzheimer Europe, the European AIDS Treatment Group, and the Fondation Saint Juan de Dieu came together a few weeks ago to think about organising this joint webinar. And as Secretary General of the EPF, it's a real pleasure to join my welcoming words to all of you. Patient engagement in medicines R&D is the responsibility of all the stakeholders who have skin in the game, including, of course, patient organisations. And it goes without saying that bringing the patient community voices into the development process of drugs is not yet the norm or a common practice, despite the enormous efforts from many people. It's still too ad hoc, it's still a bit too piecemeal. You'll hear today about really great examples from initiatives led by patient organisations, our community. And these will span from engagement with industry, with regulators, but also specific efforts that are being made to include the voice of potentially vulnerable populations such as children and young patients and older people living with dementia. Why is this important to the European Patients Forum? We believe, as many of you do, that the involvement of the patient community as a key partner in the drug development process is a milestone that enhances the creation of value for all. To have, at the end of the day, better health outcomes via swifter availability of drugs that are really tailored to fit the needs, the unmet needs of patients and our communities. And of course, this comes with great challenges, but the patient organisations and the people we represent are without doubt a conduit to overcome these challenges and create real opportunities by being trusted partners and also being proactive. At EPF several years ago, we engaged in the field of medicines R&D by co-leading the very first public-private partnership of its kind, aimed to train and empower the patient representatives to take their role in drug development, EUPATI, the European Patient Academy on Therapeutic Innovation. This was supported by the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is a funding branch of the European Commission that associates public and private funds and public and private partnerships. It was a bold move, but it was a great success. Indeed, EUPATI, the European Patients Academy on Therapeutic Innovation, is now a central and recognised player in the field. And EUPATI has become a programme of EPF while maintaining the spirit of a public-private partnership as we look to a longer-term sustainable approach to EUPATI, so we can still deliver training to patients at the end of the next decade, for instance. Of course, EUPATI is not the alpha and omega in patient training and education. Many other organisations have their own dedicated training programme, such as the EATG Training Academy and the Eurodis Summer and Winter Schools. But by working together collaboratively, we're creating the synergy needed to ensure that patients can really play their unique role and ensure a more systematic, ethical, meaningful and sustainable patient engagement in medicines R&D. But to deliver these outcomes, training of patient representatives is not sufficient. It's an important component, but it can't be done purely by that education. The systems need to be strengthened, stakeholders need to be supported, tools need to be created, co-created, and sustainability needs to be addressed. And all of these work streams, all of these objectives are part of another important Innovative Medicines Initiative project called Paradigm, which is co-led by EPF and the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, FPIA. I don't want to go into any detail on this because the next speaker, Mathieu Bude, who's actually the coordinator of Paradigm, will unpack that for all of you listeners. But I just want to thank you once again, without further ado, for joining the webinar, the first of what we hope will actually become a series of webinars to support the community, all interested stakeholders in patient engagement. And of course, as Kun said, this is your webinar. You'll have time to ask questions at the end, and we'll make sure either during the course of this meeting or afterwards through written correspondence that you get the answers you request. So without further ado, Mathieu, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Could we have the next slide, please? So good evening, everybody. So I am Mathieu Bude. I'm the coordinator of this IMI project called Paradigm, with the mission of advancing patient engagement. Paradigm is a very nice word, but it stands for Patients Active in Research and Dialogue for an Improved Generation of Medicines. So you've seen that this webinar is joint organized by 4 patient organizations and the foundation in Barcelona, and Paradigm as a consortium supports this webinar. Next slide, please. So Paradigm is by essence a multi-stakeholder collaboration. It's a public-private partnership. As you can see on this slide, we have 34 partners coming from different stakeholders. You will recognize pharmaceutical industry, smaller biotech, foundations, patient organization. And the sticker in orange or red are the patient organization member of the consortium, but jointly co-organizing this webinar. So all of this is to drive meaningful and systematic patient engagement. So might be a bit fuzzy words, but I hope at the end of this webinar, you will get a better sense of what that means in practice. Next slide, please. So why do we need this collaboration? Most of it, the essence of it is to enhance patient engagement. It's to advancing meaningful patient engagement in the life cycle of medicine for better health outcome. So on the bottom of the slide, you have multiple stakeholders build benefits for all players. You also have the European Initiative Medicine, the Innovative Medicine Initiative funded project, and everything is fueled by co-creation. We don't believe that one stakeholder can build everything by itself. It's by co-creation that we're going to advance patient engagement. Next slide, please. So Paradigm is a distinct voice in the patient engagement landscape. Many of you will hear that there is a lot of initiatives happening in patient engagement. This is the truth, and I will come back to that later more in detail. But our mission is very specific, is to contribute to a sustainable framework that enables meaningful patient engagement and demonstrates the return on engagement for all players, with two concrete objectives: is to develop processes and tools that are currently missing in the landscape, and to develop a sustainability roadmap. We do believe that we need to have the system becoming more sustainable in terms of patient engagement to drive this cultural change further. Paradigm is not, again, it's a phrase that Nicola used, the alpha or omega in patient engagement. And we, as Paradigm, with the manpower we have, with the knowledge we have, we're going to focus on 3 decision points in the life cycle of medicine. So very early in research and priority setting, in the design of clinical trials, and in early dialogue with regulators and HTA bodies. Obviously, the maturity of those fields are completely different, but still, even in a field which is a bit more mature, like the design of clinical trial, there are many things, many tools, many process, many methods that are currently missing, and we aim to develop those. Next slide, please. So we had one aspiration in Paradigm, is to contribute to a more structured, a structured, meaningful, sustainable, and ethical patient engagement. I know it's a mindful, but all the words here are very important. We need to have a patient engagement structured, because now it's done on an artisanal way. Sometimes it's a great initiative from people, but it needs to be structured. It needs to be meaningful, obviously. It needs to be sustainable, and above everything, it has to be ethical, and that we all agree on that. We know that there is 3 core concepts in patient engagement. It's patient education and training. It's guidance on engagement. So how do we do guidance? And it's sustainability in terms of concept, resources, and processes. We know that patient education and training, that's something that has been worked on by UPATI and other training initiatives. And guidance on engagement, and you've seen those 2 publications from UPATI on how to do patient engagement, but a lot is missing. And Paradigm is going to fill some of this gap by working on this. So we're going to work on the 2 blocks, guidance on engagement that are missing, and sustainability that is a less mature field. Next slide, please. So we want to adopt a virtuous development process. So first of all, and I hope you all answer our survey on expectation and aspiration on patient engagement. So what are your needs in terms of a community? So first we need to understand the needs. We do that with online survey, and that's been done. The results are being analyzed, so be patient for the results, please. Then we also have focus group, and we have a Delphi methodology to prioritize what comes out of the survey. Then we're going to have a gap analysis, what's currently missing in terms of practices document. We're also going to develop tools and metrics. Metrics is important. How do you measure patient engagement, the impact of patient engagement, the impact, but also the process? And that's very powerful in the environment, because this is a gap, and we already know that. The consortium knows that. And also, again, the needs feed the work on the sustainability of patient engagement. How do we have the toolkit that we're going to propose with the guidance and the tools and the metrics, how this is taken up by the different stakeholders, and how can we work on institutionalization of the recommendations? So there is a lot of work to do, and that will go through, obviously, internal communication, but that's not the most important. It will be also external communication and engagement. So that's the whole process. It's a virtuous development process, we believe. Next slide, please. So the intended outcome. So you have this prism on your screen. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can recognize the fantastic logo of Paradigm. And through this prism, we aim to strengthen understanding of stakeholder needs, expectation for engagement. So that's a work which is currently analyzed. We want to ensure maximum synergies with similar initiatives, because doing this by ourselves and duplicating what the other have done, this is not the way Paradigm is going to work. We're seeking synergies and avoiding duplication. We want to work we want to develop, a workable suite of tools, a roadmap which is workable, and metrics and how to measure. because altogether we do believe that this will strengthen the readiness of the system. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a very high-level snapshot of our deliverable. So we had the first of this kind, first open forum on patient engagement. That was on the slide, yeah, in March, in April this year. So we started in March. 1 month after, we start convening all together with the representative of other initiatives to work together. What are we going to do? What the other have been doing, and because we don't want to duplicate. We're doing this stakeholder assessment of needs, expectation, and aspiration with these different methodologies. So that's work which is being done, and you could, I hope, again, contribute with our online survey. This will be presented at the second open forum, probably end of the year next year, where we're gonna have more understanding of the suite of the tools that we develop. Let's try to try them, those tools, if that's possible. We define the metrics again, then we have the open forum, and then we end in 2020, in August 2020. So it's a really short project, and that's why we don't plan to cover all aspects of patient engagement, but to focus on 3 main decision points in the life cycle of a medicine or the development of a medicine. So that's one analysis, one criteria, but also on very specific topic, because we know our limits, but we have a promising outcome already. Next slide, please. As I said, we don't want to duplicate. And to not duplicate, Paradigm started the Paradigm International Liaison Group called PILG, which is a linkage point for resources and advice. So how are we going to do? And that's very important. So we link and align with external initiatives. We seek for advice and insight. That's very important. And of course, we use the PILG as dissemination and reach out. Within the PILG, some initiatives may be known by you guys. For instance, UPATI obviously is one of the PILG member, one of the founder, I would say, of this PILG. We also have the patient-focused medicine development, more known as PFMD, which is a global initiative to work on patient engagement as well. So that's very important for us as Paradigm to link with them very efficiently, because many synergies here. On the US, and that's very important because a lot of things are happening in the US, we're linking with academic groups gathered in Faster Cure, for instance, that are also working. Many of you know the DIA, the Drug Information Association, that gathered mostly individuals from pharmaceutical industry. And those folks are very interesting in measuring the return on engagement. So we need to work together on that front, and that's the plan. And of course, there is also another IMI project which is called Prefer on preference studies, and we even signed a memorandum of understanding with them, and that will be published in September. So you have the premiere for that. But this is very important. Then we have an exchange of data. We have a co-analysis of some of the data we have, co-publication, feedback, and guidance and advice for each of the projects. So we really work hand in hand with our environment, and we do believe that's the way to go. Next slide, please. Of course, I will stop here. There's many more information on our website, imi-paradigm.eu. You can follow us on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and we also have a couple of videos on YouTube. If you want to Google Paradigm is a very popular word on Google. The most easy is to type Paradigm and IMI, and we will pop up first. Voila, that's the end of my slide, of my presentation. If you have any question, either during the question session or afterwards, you could contact me directly, and you will have the contact details on the follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. I think this is a very good opening to actually the second part of our webinar, which is more about the patient engagement, what it is now and how it should look like. And we have a first speaker under that session, Giulio, who's going to talk a bit about engaging with industry, which is the European Community Advisory Board example. So, Giulio,
yes,
I give the floor to you.
thank you, Kun. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for attending this webinar. I will try and tell you something about the history and the reality now of the European Community Advisory Board, ECAB, which is the group which interact with pharmaceutical industries, and not only pharmaceutical industries, related to the health of people living with HIV. Next slide, please. Few notes about myself. I am 52 years old, diagnosed with HIV in 97. I'm a journalist, and I chair the European Community Advisory Board for 4 years, in the past 4 years. Next slide, please. So just to give you the context of the HIV advocacy movement, which I'm sure you know began in the US very early after the first cases of AIDS in the early 80s of the last century. Already in 1983, during one of the first conferences about this new pandemic or new epidemic, which was almost scaring everybody, a group of people living with AIDS met and they discussed a document which is known as Denver Principles, where the main statement was, we do not want to be labeled as victims. We want to be part of the process. We want to, we have our dignity, and we want it to be respected by every other stakeholders. So this major passage from being victims to decision makers to part of the movement was at the very beginning of the AIDS movement itself. Next slide. This led to a strong engagement of patients in the whole process. I will not go through all the successes which were are part of the history of the US movement, US HIV movement, but since the very beginning, they managed to be involved in the decision-making process. And I think this is the very first case where, in a structured way, a large group of people living with the disease managed to get to have their voices heard when designing a clinical trial, when approving a medicine, or when trying to include people into the research, and many other aspects. Next slide, please. In Europe, the movement started a bit later, in the early 90s. Well, there were already several organizations at the national level, but the need of having a European movement was felt more or less at the beginning of the 90s. I want to clarify the context where this happened, because there who had HIV or AIDS at those time was about to die very soon, because there were no treatment options, so there was no hope for surviving. The clinical trials about the new treatment, the new potential treatment, were in some way the only hope that people had to survive, to maybe survive. So it was better to try and join a clinical trial rather than living with AIDS in that way. In this context, you can understand that collaboration, trying to have your voice heard, is quite important, but also having research conducted in an ethical way is also very important. Next slide, please. So the collaboration with the industry began at more or less in '96 at a European level, when the European Community Advisory Board, the first meeting was held, In those same years, the European Medicine Agency was created, started its collaboration also with EATG. So there was a dialogue on how to accelerate the approval of new treatment options for AIDS. The first, of course, there were already some community advisory boards which were held at the level of each company. So a pharmaceutical company could have a group of people living with AIDS and listening to them as a community advisory board. But this was kind of guided from the company themselves, so it was not independent from the pharmaceutical company. The ICAB was the first attempt to create something independent, something which could represent the individual constituency, not the individual constituency, but the community as a large, in a broader sense. So it is not about me or my organization being represented there, but I am part of a group which is supposed to represent the community with all the companies at the same time. Next slide, please. So now the European Community Advisory Board has 114 members from 34 countries. The principles are more or less the same: independency first, engagement, so that the people must be in contact with the community, must be engaged in the discussion, must bring something into the activity. Accountability is crucial, because you must be accountable to the organization, but also to your community, and being able to report back and also to bring from your community the inputs for the meetings. Capacity and expertise also are very important principles. Next slide, please. So this is to show the structure of ICAB within the framework of the European AIDS Treatment Group, EATG. ICAB is one of the three main working groups of EATG, the other ones being the Policy Working Group and the Treatment Group. The interaction of ICAB is with the pharmaceutical companies, but also with other patient organizations and CABs. There is also interaction with academia and other stakeholders like regulatory agencies and so on. And in general, EATG has a strong interaction with the scientific community as a large. Next slide, please. Some points about the ICAB works. The main component of ICAB work is the regular meeting we have with pharmaceutical companies to discuss the research and development plans, but also we review their protocol, the clinical trial protocols for most of the companies involved in the HIV field. Some companies are still refusing to submit their protocol to review for patient organization. We monitor adverse events. We try to listen early result of the clinical trials, and also the main objective in general is to maintain the visibility of the community of patients participating in clinical trials. Next slide, please. Very briefly, I will not go through all the points, but the contribution of ICAB to the scientific research is related to the whole process of medicine development, from the planning to the results analysis and dissemination. Next slide, please. Also, there are yes, okay. Some few points about the meetings with pharmaceutical companies, in case you are interested in that. The ICAB sets the agenda for the meeting, so it is this is something, according to me, quite important, because it is the community, the people living with HIV, the patients, who take the initiative of listing the questions and the issues that we want to discuss with pharmaceutical companies. Of course, pharmaceutical companies can ask to introduce a topic in the agenda, but this is done only when it is acceptable from our side. Next slide, please. behind the work we do with pharmaceutical industries, they are also meeting with academic researchers. We try to do our best to contribute to a focused and real pharmacovigilance, so to say, just trying to make sure that what people are really experiencing is reported back to the pharmacovigilance authorities. Also, we are expanding our work towards biomedical prevention, cure research, patient-reported outcome measures, and other topics. Next slide, please. Some of the achievements of the ECAB are listed here. I will not go through all of them. You will be able to read the slides yourselves, but I think that some key points are trying to have clinical trials who are designed to include a group of people which is as much as possible similar to those who are going to use the medicines after its approval. So trying to have a representativeness of the population in clinical trials is quite important according to us. Also, ICAM members are part of the DSMB in some clinical trials. And next slide, please. Also, I think that having the possibility to exchange our experience with other patient organizations from other disease areas is quite important. To close my presentation, I want to quote what Nikos Dedes, the ATG chair at this moment, said in a conversation, that the ECAB experience is useful for both sides, just both for community and for industry, and also other stakeholders involved, because the earliest possible engagement with patients is beneficial for industry because they can better understand the needs of the community of patients and so develop some medicines or tools who are more likely to address those needs, and community understand what research is and how it operates in this exchange. So my personal knowledge increased a lot when having my activity at the ECAB. My next slide is my last slide, and I thank you for your attention. Happy to receive any question you have.
Thank you, Giulio, for this real practice example of direct patient engagement, in this case with the pharmaceutical industry on a one-to-one basis. We will have a second example now presented by Lisa Ferrer from Eurordis on how to engage with EMA and working on HTA.
Thank
Lisa?
you, Giulio.
Yes.
And yes, hi. Thank you, Giulio, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. My name is Elisa Ferrer, and I'm Patient Engagement Senior Manager at Eurordis, the umbrella organization representing patients living with rare diseases in Europe. Next, please. So on the patient engagement at the EMA, at the European Medicines Agency, since its creation, the agency has interacted with patients and has reached important milestones that some of them I have highlighted here. Like, for example, when the patients became full members of the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products in 2000, when the orphan regulation came into force. So that was the first time that patients were included in a scientific committee with full rights. Another important milestone was setting up a framework for interaction with patient and consumer organizations that was adopted at the agency, and and of course the creation of the Patients and Consumers Working Party as a platform for patient and consumers organizations to make recommendations to the agency on the matters that on the subjects that matter to patients. And from now on, next slide, please. The patient involvement in EMA activities has steadily and significantly increased over the past years, as you can see here. And next, please. The types of involvement involvement, can be classified into 3 categories. Patients can be involved at the agency representing the patient community at large, as they do being part of the EMA management board and also in the scientific committees. Patients can also represent their own organizations, like at the Patient and Consumers Working Party, and in other activities like the public hearings, for example. Patients can be involved as individual experts on their own disease, for example, when they are giving input into the scientific advice and protocol assistance procedures. Next slide, please. The EMA works through a network of eligible organizations which fulfill a series of criteria set by the agency, like, for example, being an umbrella organization and having the scope across the EU, and having an interest as well on medicines development, and being transparent on the funding and the grants they receive. Next slide, please. As an example, practical example on the Eurordis contribution, Eurordis is an eligible EMA patient organization. Cooperates with the EMA in the protocol assistance procedure by assessing the need for patients' input in those procedures, and identifying the patients to be involved in them and guiding them through the process. Just to give you a figure, in the past years, of around 60% of the dossiers needing patient input have actually a patient involved. Next slide, please. Like I said, patients can register themselves as individual experts in the EMA expert database, and as such can be involved in. Next slide, please. It was fine. Thank you. As such, can be involved in, like I mentioned earlier, in scientific advice. So scientific advice, as you know, is a type of procedure in which the medicine developers ask the EMA for advice on their clinical development, if they are performing the right studies, and regarding to the clinical development of the drugs they are developing. Next, please. So what is the type of input that patients can provide into those procedures? Protocol assistance, just for clarification, is the scientific advice procedure related to orphan products. So as this slide shows, several aspects of the development plan, patients can have a really important input, like, for example, the patient population to be included in the study, the clinical endpoints to be measured to determine if they are measuring what it matters to their disease. Also aspects on the quality of life, and also on the study feasibility. Is the clinical trial design really adapted to patients, or is it going to cause such a burden that it will may cause dropouts, or not even patients being recruited? So all these questions and others, the patients involved in those procedures can have a very significant input into those. Next, please. To participate in the EMA activities, and like I said, the EMA established a framework of interaction. One of these one of the requirements to be fulfilled in this framework with interaction with patients, but not only with patients, but with other experts as well, is the compliance with the EMA policy on competing interest. So each patient representative, when you are engaged in one of these activities, patients need to declare their interest, but like I said, like any other experts involved, and then also sign a confidentiality agreement. And then the requirements might vary for scientific advice and participation in a scientific committee or in scientific advice. I highlighted it in this slide. They might be different than from participating in other activities. So in some cases, it might be more restrictive than others. But anyway, the EMA will assess if there was consultancy related with a pharmaceutical company, if patients had a strategic advisory role, financial interest, and so on. So transparency is of utmost importance for the EMA, and yeah, and all this procedure needs it's a must before getting engaged in the activity per se. Next slide, please. So that was a very brief summary on patient engagement at the EMA. And now the second part of my presentation is focusing on patient engagement at the HTA level. Next slide, please. So here, this slide summarizes what we call the 3 steps of patients' access to medicine. So first, medicine needs to demonstrate the efficacy in the context of a clinical trial, so in a controlled environment. Then it needs to show that the medicine works in clinical practice, so in normal real life conditions. So it has to show clinical effectiveness. And before the medicine can reach to the patients, pricing and reimbursement decisions are being taken. So is society willing to pay for that for that medicine? And here HTA plays a role. So HTA, which stands for, as you know, as Health Technology Assessment, measures the added value of a technology compared with what is currently out there. So with existing technologies and with its standard of care. And it's used at national level to support decision making about reimbursement. And as you see, decisions made on reimbursement have a huge impact on access to on patients' access to medicines and access to care. So that's why patients as end users of the technology should be involved in these assessments. Next slide, please. Not going to go into much details, but patients can play a role in different aspects, being those, for example, the full assessments, or also, for example, in early dialogues with regulators, HTA bodies, and companies. Early dialogues are very important to produce an adequate data set that will fulfill the needs of both regulators and HTAs alike. Other activities such as horizon scanning and scoping, also patients can also play a role into them. Next, please. Like I said, HTA is carried out at a national and even regional level in some countries. It was felt the need some years ago, well, over 10 years ago, that a European cooperation to get a collaborative environment between member states and HTA was needed, and that led to the creation of the European network on HTA. And this is it aims, like I said, to make this collaboration between all member states and increase the efficiency of the HTA processes. Next slide, please. So the UNETA and currently this particular John Axton 3, which is currently they are currently working on, has two main areas of work: the evidence generation, in which early dialogues in a series of pilots are being done, and also the parallel consultation with the EMA and HTA bodies, which was launched in 2017, and now sponsors have a common entry point instead of going individually to each ATH body. And also the other area of work is the joint production. So the production of joint assessments, for example, the relative effectiveness assessment, that will be the basis for the national HTA assessments and the decision making, ensuring that is uptake of these joint reports by as many as European countries as possible. Next, please. Okay, this is just very briefly to show how patient organizations are shaping patient engagement in UNETA. There is no framework at UNETA currently, an established framework like the EMA has, and therefore the patient organizations involved in UNETA are creating their own systems to engage patients. And this sort of a staircase shows the process from when UNETA launches a request for a patient to be involved, for example, in an early dialogue, until the patient organization umbrella patient organization in UNETA shares the contact and the patient is involved. So it goes through a mentoring process, an identification and mentoring process of the patients that are going to be lastly involved. Next, please. That's my last slide, and that was the key issues and take-home messages of this. That the framework is being established. Let's say, and then the European umbrella patient organization are putting in place systems to get patients involved. And to finalize, as Nicola mentioned in the beginning, training is very important through all the training programs available in order to be fully involved in those assessments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisa. Just as a reminder for the people listening, if you have questions, please, you can use the question boxes. And I see we already received a few, one for Giulio, one for your orders as well. So we have two speakers that are still remaining. One, the first one will be the case of people with dementia, putting a focus on vulnerable populations that also should be part of stronger community involvement. So I welcome Ana Diaz from the Alzheimer Europe to present on people with dementia.
Thank you very much, Cohen, and good evening, everybody. My name is Ana Diaz. I am project officer at Alzheimer Europe, and as Cohen was already saying, the next two presentations are about patient engagement in the case of potentially vulnerable populations. Next, please. Before discussing the topic which is of interest today, I would like to say a few words about living with dementia. According to the most recent estimates, there are some 9 million people in Europe living with dementia. The most important risk factor for developing dementia is age. However, some younger people, for example, people in their 50s, in their 40s, and in some cases even in their 30s, can also get dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. In case of those of you who are not familiar with this condition, dementia is an overall term that describes a set of symptoms that might include memory loss and difficulties with thinking, problem solving or language, and other symptoms. These symptoms should be severe enough to interfere with daily life and functioning. There's also some people who have also behavior and change in their behavior and mood. And also to remind that dementia has also, of course, social and psychosocial impact on the people who live with the condition. Dementia, in fact, is a form of disability. People with dementia nevertheless experience these symptoms in different ways. Not every person that will experience the same symptoms and in the same form. This might be linked, for instance, to the type of dementia, but also to the area of the brain which is affected by the condition. Dementia is a progressive condition. That means that the symptoms will get worse over time. To date, dementia has no cure. However, there is some pharmaceutical and also non-pharmaceutical interventions and some care and support which can help to alleviate the symptoms and help people to live better with dementia. Many people today are living well with dementia after the diagnosis. Next, please. Now, I would like to focus on the area of interest today, patient engagement in the area of dementia, and to say beforehand that traditionally and for many years, people with dementia have not been included in research or in patient engagement activities. And very often there has been the reliability and validity of the views and opinions of a person with dementia have been questioned, and also many issues such as consent and capacity to take part have been perceived as barriers for their participation. In this context, for years, the perspective of the carers or the people caring for a person with dementia had been sought instead. However, we have evidence that the priorities, preferences, and the perspective of people with dementia are not always the same as those of the carers. Next, please. Over the last decades, and in some reason more than others in Europe, and also due to many different reasons, perhaps the diagnosis is now being more timely, more at mild stages rather than moderate or severe dementia. There's more people with dementia themselves speaking up in different forums. And also perhaps, I want to be optimistic here, there's less stigma about living with dementia. There's been more recognized the relevance of involving people with dementia in both aspects, as research participants, but also as being involved in PPI, patient and public involvement, and patient engagement. Also, there is a lot of evidence that with appropriate support, people with dementia can be meaningfully involved. There are many examples of this patient engagement in the context of psychosocial research and in some European projects and in some particular countries, for instance, in the UK, in some of the Nordic countries, there's more and more experiences. However, there is less frequent to find examples of patient engagement in the process of developing medicines, which is actually what we are talking about today. Next, please. And this is when Paradigm, I think, is really a very timely project and very relevant for people with dementia, because the core values of Paradigms, as Nicola and Matthew were saying, sorry, next, are to make patient engagement to be a common practice across the medicine's research and development process, but also to be inclusive of all of patients. And this is something really relevant for some of the patients who have specific needs. Next, please. Next. So patient engagement in developing medicines is relevant to every single patient. There will be the people who will be taking the medicines that will be developed. So that's relevant for every one patient. However, there's a recognition that for some patients, might be more challenging and more difficult to take part in patient engagement. And this might be due, for instance, to the condition. And as we were thinking about dementia, that could be the case of subconditions where there might be more challenges to be able to participate in a meaningful way. But this can also be sometimes part of other aspects related to social conditions or also the environment. And also we cannot forget that some people might have very specific needs, and we might need to develop a specific measure to address these needs if we want to involve them in a meaningful way. And this is with this in mind that Alzheimer Europe, together with San Juan de Dios in Spain, we are working together in Paradigm to try to understand better and address the needs of what we call the potentially vulnerable populations. And in our case, Alzheimer Europe is looking in more detail at people with dementia, and San Joan de Déu, Begoña will be speaking after me, is looking more at the needs and circumstances of children and young people. Next, please. I just wanted to give you a bit of background about Alzheimer Europe. We are a non-governmental organization. We are an umbrella organization in Europe. We have 40 members as today. Our members are national Alzheimer associations, and we are represented in 35 countries. You can see in the map in green the countries from which we have members. You have also in the picture our executive director, Jean-Georges, and then a picture of our members in Berlin last year in our conference in 2017 in the annual general meeting. Next, please. And it's in this context I want to introduce the European Working Group of People with Dementia. This is a working group of people with dementia which was set up by Alzheimer Europe in 2012. The group is composed entirely of people with dementia. They are people nominated by our members, by the national Alzheimer organizations, and they are part of the group for 2-year terms. In the last term, 2016-2018, we have had 10 to 12 members. I'm saying 10 to 12 because sometimes some of them have to withdraw for different reasons and new members have joined. So we have 12 people with different types of dementia and from different countries and with different stage of the disease. The group was set up to ensure that our activities, our projects and activities duly reflect the priorities and views of people with dementia. The group meets face-to-face 3 or 4 times a year. As you can see in the different pictures, this is the group of the first picture is one of the pictures of the group in 2016, and this is actual picture photos of meetings of the groups working in different projects. They are involved in many different activities in our conference itself, but also they are involved in many European projects about dementia and mainly the contributions through public and patient engagement. You can see there also Helen Rochford Brennan, who is the chair of the group, and Chris Robert, who is the vice chair, and then many other of the members. Next, please. In terms of our involvement in Paradigm, and I think that this is a very important first idea, and it's about this need to understand better how patient engagement in the area of dementia is current in Europe. So we are working with our members to get a better understanding of the situation at a global level of the involvement of people with dementia in developing drugs in Europe. And we had already a consultation with our members, and we have a short survey with them about their experiences and what they're doing in that domain. But also in a more granular, to understand better the granular needs, we have one of the workshops that Matthew was mentioning at the beginning, and we had a consultation with our group of people with dementia in Brussels in June, where we tried to understand better the motivation, needs, and outcomes of participating in patient engagement in the case of people with dementia. Next, please. And I'd like just to finish with a quote. We had an interview with Chris Roberts, the vice chair of the group, after the consultation about Paradigm in Brussels. And you have there the link, imiparadigm.eu/blog, where you can see the full interview. But I just want to finish with a few words of the interview and what he said about this consultation. And particularly like the Paradigm is working for making patient engagement possible for all patients. We, as people affected by dementia, do really appreciate the lens that these organizing agencies and companies go to in order to involve us, and we absolutely appreciate what they are trying to do on our behalf. So just to show you, there's a real interest also in the area of dementia to get further involvement and to learn and to continue working from the experience of other patient groups which have more experience in that areas. Next, please. Just thank you everybody for their attention. There's my email there. If anyone needs to drop me an email, any questions, they're very much welcome. Thank you.
So thank you, Anna. And then for the last presentation, we will go to Begoña from the Hospital San Juan de Dios, if that's it's pronounced in a bit of an acceptable way. Talking about the case of children and young people to highlight another potential vulnerable population. Begonia?
Thank you
Welcome.
very much. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody that is connected in this interesting webinar. I'm going to speak on behalf of the children and young people, and also regarding the clinicians and the researchers that are involved in the drug development addressed specifically for this group of vulnerable population. If you go to the next slide, I want to focus here that children and young people historically have been excluded regarding the research about drug development for ethical considerations, but you know that there are a lot of conditions that only children and young people are suffering. If we speak in terms of the number of the people that at this moment in Europe belongs to this group of population, we are speaking around the 21st percent of the population of Europe. But I want to focus here my message that these people represents our future. For the reason it's very important to invest resources in the pediatric conditions to have healthy people in the future in our European environment. If you go to the next slide, I want to focus here what are the main problems or the difficulties that we need to face every day in a pediatric hospital when we treat children and young people. Basically, we are prescribing medicines that around the 50% of these medicines have been never tested with children and young people. It means that these drugs become from the adult field, and sometimes the doctors need to test and prove what are the right doses for every kind of patient. It's another wall also inside of the group of the children and young people, the case of the premature, because in this case, 90% of the medicines that we are prescribing have never become for clinical trials addressed specifically for this group of population. It means that we need, as I say, to increase the research in this field. Next slide. What are the issues that also we are facing every day with pediatric patients? A big number of these patients are suffering rare conditions, and most of them don't have any kind of treatments. It means that when we have the opportunity to include a patient in a pediatric clinical trials, hopefully it can be the unique opportunity to access a treatment. Another important issue that we need to face in our daily life in the hospital is that the protocols of the pediatric clinical trials usually become from the adult field. It means that are not usually adapted to the particularities of being a children, and imagine a person with that are growing up and with the body in development. This is a very important issue that we need to face. Part of these protocols also include a non-feasible inclusion and exclusion criteria. It means that it's so difficult sometimes to try to find a candidate for these studies, and this is very important. And the other thing is that if I say that these protocols, these clinical trials are not adapted for the children because they become from the adult field, it means that also are not patient-centric, and they are not never considering what it means to be a child, and considering the quality of life of the children and the family, because at the end, when a pediatric patient participates in a trial, it's the whole family who is involved. Next slide, please. Another need that we need to face is that we are prescribing medicines, as I mentioned, with an off-label use. Sometimes we don't have the validated tools to measure the outcomes of these studies. Another concern is the use of placebo, because we don't have sometimes the opportunity to compare a trial with approved medicine or with the right standard of care, because we are prescribing, as I said, off-label medicines. And the other difficulty is that we are speaking about the small samples of patients, and it's not easy to recruit the patients. Next slide, please. What are we doing in the hospital in order to face these problems and to try to help the different stakeholders to perform more patient-centered pediatric clinical trials? We set up in 2015 a young persons advisory group with the name Kids Barcelona. This is a group of young people that it's part of the staff of our hospital. They are volunteers. Once in a month, they are working with us, and they are the voice of the children and young people of the whole hospital to try to improve the different research projects regarding clinical trials and also innovation to make them more patient-centric. This young persons advisory group has been trained for a long time. I want to focus and to point that the education is a key point to have people to be involved and engaged in drug development. And once they have been trained, they are able to contribute to the projects because they are able to understand what it's a protocol, what it's a placebo, and other parts of the wording and the methods that are behind of the clinical trials. If you move to the next slide. This is a summary of the main features of the YPACs, the Young Persons Advisory Group. Usually are groups between people, including between people 11 to 18 years old. In the case of the team of our hospital, the starting age is 12, because in Spain is the age where pediatric patients need to ascend as a participant of a pediatric clinical trial. They have a common interest in science and in pediatric medicine because they need to be motivated to help us and to attend to the sessions that we perform every month. We perform to them a specific training involving different professionals of our institution. They know the different facilities where we perform the research projects, and they are very close with the people that in the real world are working in the trials, not only regarding the researchers or the principal investigators or the clinicians, also with the ethics committee. The main goal that we try to achieve in the feedback sessions that we perform every month is to collect this feedback, these new ideas, and all the things that we need to improve to address in the right way the studies that we are performing accordingly with the needs of the patients. If you move to the next slide. At this point, the young patients advisory groups are a limited number around Europe. I have a slide specifically where you can see a map and identify the groups that are working. The first one was established in the Alder Hey Hospital in Liverpool in 2006. And at this moment, one of the goals that we have at the European level, because we set up a European network of YPACs, is to try to arrive all the stakeholders to explain that the patient engagement in pediatrics is feasible, it's neat, because it's the only way to include the voice of the children and the needs that they can have in the activities that we do. It means that also we are very close and we are working in a very nice way with the European Medicines Agency. We participate this year in March in the workshop that they did to analyze the 10 years of the pediatric regulation. And also we are very happy about the report of this session, because one of the recommendations that are included in the report, that it's at this moment being assessed for the European Commission, and it's going to include a working plan for the next 2 years, is this statement that you can read here. The European Medicines Agency, it's in favor and has a positive interest to try to standardize the consultation of patients and young people in all the steps of the medicine's life cycle, and with the collaborations of all the sponsors and ethics committee. It means that the European Medicines Agency is going to consider and it's going to take into account when a protocol is submitted if the pediatric patients, the children and young people, have been consulted in order to design a study that can be feasible for them. This is a very good news for us, and we expect that in the upcoming years, all the sponsors and all the different stakeholders involved in drug development can move ahead in the same direction. Next slide, please. This is a nice slide that summarizes the life cycle to develop a medicine, to perform a clinical trial, and to arrive to the stage to have a market authorization of a drug. And here in the different boxes, we have included several examples about the activities that we can perform with the children and young people. Because sometimes when you speak about pediatrics, you only consider that they are the participants of the research, but also they can be engaged, as I said, and be an active participant from the very early stages to the last ones. If you read the boxes also, you can read here the different activities. They can help us to define priority research needs that they can have. For sure, they can contribute in the protocol design, and this is one of the activities that even we are developing with these groups. For sure, they are the unique people that can say that a document that they need to read, understand, and sign, it's feasible for them, it's friendly. And this is part of the work that we are doing in activities regarding the validation of the assent document. In fact, in our team, we have developed a guidance about the rules and the recommendations that the children and young people consider that are relevant from the point of view of the design and the content, that at this moment has the recommendation of the Spanish Medicines Agency for the pediatric trials that are running in our country. I'm not going to go in deep in every point, but I think that it's nice that you can understand that the patient engagement in pediatric patients is feasible and can be along the whole process to perform a pediatric trial. If you go to the next slide.
And can I encourage you to go a bit?
Yes, I'm going to explain
so that we have at least some 5-10 minutes still for
some
questions. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, this slide it's only to explain to you how works the methodology to educate, to empower, and to engage the young people in the activities regarding trials. We have always an investigator of our hospital helping us to provide the background of the condition and the explanation regarding the specific project in what they are contributing. And on the other hand, we have the facilitator of the session that creates the right environment for the children and young people and the right methodology to collect their feedback to improve this study. If you go to the next slide. This is the slide that I mentioned that summarizes the groups that are working at this moment or in the process to grow up around Europe. YPACnet is the European Young Persons Advisory Group Network. We have the recognition of the EMPRIMA. EMPRIMA is the Pediatric Networks Research of the European Medicines Agency. And the idea in the upcoming years, because also we are involved in another IMI project that is Connect for Children, is to try at least to set up one YPAC in all the European countries in order also to collect European feedback across the different countries, because also for pediatrics, it's very important to include the geographical diversity in the activities with patients. And I think that the next one, it's the last one. This is the website of our YPAC, it's barcelona.org, and this is my email if you need further information or you have any other comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Begonia, and thank you all speakers for sticking well to their time. So I suggest that we still take some of the questions for another 5, maximum 10 minutes. And the first one I would actually like to take it some bit of a general, so I'll allow the presenters to decide who wants to reply. But the first question is a bit about, are there any limits to patient involvement in drug research development process, which is a bit linked to, is there a golden standard even on what patient engagement looks like? And I would like to add to that also a question that came in during the presentations on, should there also be more patient engagement, for example, further in the drug cycle, in the market, on adherence? So it's a general question about how far does this go, and is there any limit or not to it? So who would like to reply to this one?
Hi, this is Mathieu.
Yeah,
this is Mathieu from EPF. What I will say is sounds a bit stupid, but sky is the limit. I mean, patient engagement is responsibility of all, also of patient organization, to be proactive in the way they approach patient engagement and the way they structure themselves. There is a lot of supports. We've seen that there is great examples. So once you are equipped to do patient engagement, it's never too early to engage. To engage when it's relevant for the pharma you're engaging with, but also with pharma or HTA, but also for yourself and for your organization. And that's very important to choose when you can engage, when you have the skills and the knowledge, and you have training to do that, to know more about patient engagement, how to do patient, what it means to develop a drug. And once you are equipped, and Patty, it's a wonderful source of information for this. Huh? Once you are equipped, then you can engage. And then it's up to you to engage when you want. So gold standard, there is none. And that's why in Paradigm, for instance, we're working not to standardize, but to give common tools that people can use. And then it's meaningful to the patient organization, what they want. And I think I would stop here.
Okay, and do you think post-market would be important to get more patient involvement as well, in your opinion?
Oh yeah, of course. Pharmacovigilance is a key area. So we're not in the development anymore. Maybe we can argue that at some point we are, but no, in pharmacovigilance you have your say to detect the adverse effect, to report that back, to create data set, how this is done. But I think at Eurolist you have great example of this. I don't want to throw under the bus here, but pharmacovigilance is a key area, obviously, where patient organization can engage. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Then I have a question, and maybe to start with Begonia, about how do we meaningfully represent the voice of all children and young people, even those who are profoundly affected? And I think this question is now focusing on the children and young people. It's probably a question we can ask for many of the other populations as well. How do you really meaningfully represent a certain group?
Yeah, first of all, I want to focus the importance of the training, because as I said, you need to educate people to have the right skills to be engaged and involved in this project. The other thing is that sometimes it's not feasible to involve directly the patients. This is the case, and Anna perhaps can explain a little better than me, of the people of Alzheimer. And in the case of pediatrics, of several conditions that they don't have the cognitive skills to contribute. In this case, always we try to involve people that can be very close to them. In pediatrics, it's so relevant, the role of the parents. Imagine we have many conditions that the children are affected in the cognitive way, and the only way to include the needs and the voice of the patients is through the parents. In some projects, regarding the request of advice that we receive, we need to choose what is the right way to involve which people, and also it's very important and crucial, the methodology, because sometimes there are people that consider that to send a survey to a patient or a patient organization is enough, and this is something very close, that you lose a lot of information that you can reach in other open methodologies, that you can make questions or other activities. Yeah, you need to analyze every situation and work accordingly with the needs.
Mm-hmm. Which is actually, I think you answered a little bit another question, which is about how can we actually get to next levels in the progress of patients, parents involved in the new drug development, and how to explain, for example, patient engagement on different levels. The training element that you mentioned, I think, is a crucial one for different groups in order to do that at indeed a higher and different level. I have a question also to Elisa about how is it possible as a CAP, as a community advisory board, to sign up by the EMA, how to arrange it? It's a very practical question, but then there's also a comment on there's no mentioning during the presentation about the European HTA collaboration proposals that are currently under discussion. But how can people join and provide advice at the EMA?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the presentation, the one way is to work through the AMA patient, the AMA eligible organizations. So if I don't know the affiliation of the person asking the question, but if it's from an European federation and so it's from an European umbrella organization, it may have a way to let's say sign up for eligibility. Another way is this would be at the level of the patient organization, but like I said, at the level of individual experts, there are many ways, either again through the eligible organizations, like the example I presented, that EUROR is doing this cooperation, but so are other patient organizations as well, and also signing up as individual experts. So the EMA is creating this EMA expert database to engage. Also, there are many opportunities at the EMA for getting involved, like workshops. In those workshops, normally people represent their own organizations. More recently, the public hearings at the PRAC, at the Pharmacovigilance and Risk Assessment Committee, where members of the public and from patient organizations are being invited to participate. So there's a great deal of opportunities, I would say. Yeah. And regarding the what was the other question? Sorry.
So the other was more of a comment on why wasn't there any mentioning of the European HTA collaboration proposals currently under discussion at the Commission. So it was not really a question, but just.
No, thanks for the comment. It was difficult to condense everything, and I guess they are referring to the new legislation proposal. And of course, there's a lot of work being done in that regard. And but it wasn't a question of time, actually.
Oh, that's fair enough, I suppose. There's two comments that had come in before, which I want to shortly refer to. One being on what about patients becoming authors on research publications? Are there any barriers? And the other one is actually also on the perception of community that are maybe not specialists, but kind of life specialists in what they live every day. And there's probably a lot to say about how things should go, but the evolution that I then personally see is that there is definitely a move towards including more of community expertise also in publications. It's strongly stimulated also by projects like Paradigm, which I think is a very healthy evolution, and it puts together different levels of expertise and not focusing only on the academic one. But then I have still two questions. One, well, actually two for Giulio. One is on how did you manage to work as a unit, even though there were members from different countries with different laws and regulations? So how do you then represent actually different countries? And the second one is a bit of a quality requirement. Is there any education needed to become an effective patient advocate within ECAP?
Well, thank you for these questions. I think that representing the diversity of the countries within the WHO European region, which is covered by the EATG, is actually one of the biggest challenges we have. Because for some aspects we can act as a unique body, because the HIV drugs at the EU level are approved centrally by the EMA, so there is a way to harmonize different countries at the EU level. But when we consider the WHO European region, the diversities are enormous, so they are it is very difficult. Also, there are different ways of understanding the activism in Eastern and Western countries. So it is really difficult. For my personal view, this is also something which is very formative for me, very, from a human point, very important to understand the differences and to try to find a way where my experience can be helpful for other settings. And more or less the same comes with the preparedness of members engaging in discussion with the pharmaceutical companies. I can perfectly remember my first ECAT meeting. I could understand nothing at all, completely. I thought they were discussing about something on another planet. I really could not understand. Then after some meetings, I had some questions in my mind, and I asked myself, should I ask those questions, or maybe they are just stupid, they are not. Luckily, I was lucky enough to think, I don't care. I'm here as a patient, so my questions are what are the center of the meeting, are what everybody's looking for my questions as a patient. So I asked those questions, and from that point on, I had the opportunity to learn more and more. Of course, I studied a lot. I tried to take advantage of any informative opportunity I had. So this is something that comes when you are engaged in the activity, that you get prepared by doing things.
So, which is clearly education again. I want to end with one question, as I think it is a rather relevant one, but I want to repeat to the people who are still listening also that if there's questions you really still want to raise, please send them and we'll make sure that they get answered. But there's one question that I would maybe like to ask to Mathieu before closing this webinar. It's about, are there any specific metrics, and if yes, what are they, to actually track patient engagement? Are there any examples of real tracking on how this was done?
So that's a very tricky question. So far as I know, the only metrics to measure the return on engagement is a study by CTTI. So it's a clinical initiative on clinical trial transformation initiative, exactly, in the US. And they measured the net present value of engagement. So when you put €1 into patient engagement, how much you get at the end of the day. That's the only study I know where you measure, where you put euros on patient engagement. And that's why Paradigm is also about how do you measure the process. And because there is nothing in this field so far. And that would be a key element to say, okay, this is how you can measure patient engagement. So that's how you can make it better, by measuring. And also that would be a driver of having a mindset towards more patient engagement, more meaningful patient engagement in the near future, we hope.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Following the questions that we had, I think that projects indeed like Paradigm, they do have really still a good purpose. As many of the questions that we received were indeed on how can we get involved? Are there any limits? What is the pathway? So I'm happy to see that many of the questions will also be taken forward in future research and project development. So I want to thank our speakers once again. I think it was very interesting. I received a question to share the slides with some of the people who were participating to the webinar, so I suppose that is possible. And I also want then to thank all the participants for their active contribution, and I hope they found this webinar interesting for their work. So good evening and thank you.